Hey everyone! Today we're back for chapter 2 of Why Are All the Black Kids Sitting Together in the Cafeteria by Dr. Beverly Daniel Tatum. Before we get started, I do have a few announcements. Number one, so in my chapter 1 video the other day, I gave you all an overview of what these videos would look like, which included reading the chapter to you and then discussing my highlights, powerful words, thoughts. So I spoke to a friend of mine about this, and she mentioned that the format I was going to utilize may infringe on copyright. So I did some research and she was correct. Reading some quotes and discussing concepts from books or from the chapters would fall into fair use, but simply reading the book out loud could negatively affect sales of the book from the author and thus would likely be infringement. So since I'm reading books by Black authors, especially Black women authors, that's the complete opposite of what I want to do, since I don't want to take any more financially or otherwise from Black women than I already have through my lifelong unearned privilege. So I'll be changing the format of the videos going forward. I plan to discuss the concept of the chapter, read some key quotes that I highlighted, just like I did last time towards the end, and I'll still provide my highlights in the show notes as I did before. I'm so sorry to those that were excited to have access to the book, especially for financial reasons. But there are apps such as Libby that you can check out audiobooks from the library. I think you just have to have a library card. Additionally, it's a good reminder to myself and all of us really that none of us are perfect and that intention does not equal impact. I'm messy. It's in my name, but grateful for every teachable moment. And this is one of them and has been for me. So I just definitely want to correct that action going forward. Announcement number 2, if anyone took notice of my White Mess Express logo on the thumbnail covers for these videos I'm doing on the book, it was created by one of my best friends, Teresa. I sent her my inspiration and she created an absolute masterpiece from it, and I really, really love it. I'll link her socials in the notes today so you can follow her and maybe eventually hire her to design a logo of your own if you want to. And then announcement number 3, as many of you know, I lost my job on February 13th of this year. So I'm currently not able to get unemployment because I started the process of licensing my LLC that I had been thinking about doing for quite a while. In Florida, if you have an LLC, you're considered employed even if the business hasn't officially went live yet and is not bringing in any income. So I'm applying for jobs that align with my morals and values, but I'd really love to have more financial security while I get my business up and running and do what I love to do. These videos are time consuming to create and edit. Even though I love to do them, it is time consuming. So if they're helpful for you or you enjoy any of my other content, please consider contributing a donation financially. I do have a link in my bio that takes you to links where you can give to my GoFundMe, Cash App, or subscribe to me on Patreon. All of those, any of those would help me, and I would be super grateful. I really hope not to have to request donations for very long. Anyone that has followed me for a long time or knows me well knows that discussing my anti-racism journey with my fellow white comrades is very, very close to my heart, and I do believe my responsibility. But right now, I just really have to be honest with my communities that I really could use the help, and I'm just in a rough spot at the moment. But okay. With all of that out of the way, so to speak, let's jump into chapter 2. Yeah. Okay. So chapter 2 was called The Complexity of Identity. Who am I? And I feel like I almost highlighted the entire chapter, to be honest. I absolutely loved it. So she starts off by talking about the concept of identity and how it's very complex and it's shaped by characteristics, family dynamics, social, political, like where we live, so many different things. And then she goes on to talk about like what we see and how that is projected back to us. So she talks about social scientist Charles Cooley and how he talked about a long time ago, other people are the mirror in which we see ourselves. So basically we are going to look around at society, and that is how we determine who we are, by what is reflected back to us. So Let's see. So then she goes on to talk about how who we say we are is dependent on a lot of factors, and talks about Erik Erikson, which many of us learned about in school, who is the psychoanalytic theorist. And he really coined the term like identity crisis and introduced that that like our social, cultural, and historical context is the ground in which our individual identity is embedded. And that was very, very interesting to me. And she goes on to write, and this is a quote, "The self-creation of one's identity is commonly experienced in the United States and other Western societies during the period of adolescence. Though the foundation of identity is laid in the experiences of childhood, younger children lack the physical and cognitive development needed to reflect on the self in this abstract way." She goes on to say, quote, "Choices made in adolescence ripple throughout the lifespan." So she starts off by saying, like, who am I? And discusses that adolescence is that key time in which our identity is developed. I think I knew this, but I didn't know. Like, and if I did, I've forgotten. And I do remember in developmental psychology learning about adolescence, and that the period of identity that you go through is that one of who am I, who am I not? And that's why a lot of people succumb to more peer pressure and all of those kind of things in adolescence, aside from hormones and that kind of thing. Puberty is very rough. But that's why I had thought that this particular series that I was doing might be helpful for people that are homeschooling their kids, not small children, more adolescent age, because the concepts are obviously more mature as far as being able to cognitively make sense of like the terminology we use, the ideas, the theories, that kind of thing. And really, I think that what had me considering those things was because it's all starts with our identity. Like, who am I is the first and arguably most important, maybe not the first, but one of them, questions that we have to ask ourselves. And that happens in adolescence. And so I think that this content, and that's one reason why my videos are not about CRT necessarily, but I do think that that is one of the reasons that it is such a unfortunate thing that so many books are being banned in schools, that CRT has such a negative connotation from society with the Moms of Liberty, that kind of thing, is because I think that it is very important that if we want this education to be given about what makes good people, you know, like what is racism, that adolescence is the key time for those concepts to be introduced. Not to say that adults cannot deconstruct, I have, but it's just interesting to think about some of the priorities of certain political figures and groups, and then look at what are we possibly trying to suppress, if that makes sense. At least that was what my thinking was when I read. The next section in this chapter is Who Am I? Multiple Identities. And she talks about which parts of our identity capture our attention first. And she talked about a classroom exercise that she does with students where she asked them to complete the sentence, "I am blank," which the anti-racism workbook, I can't remember who wrote that, but I'll put it in the notes. I just can't remember the author's name off the top of my head. It starts with a K, but I'll add that in the notes under the things to read. But they have a very similar exercise where they have you list out your identity. And they talk about, and I've heard before, a lot of people link their identity to their occupation or their family status. Like, I'm a sister, I'm a mom, I'm a dad, I'm a brother, I'm a teacher, I'm a nurse, I'm a doctor, I'm a police officer. And they link their identity to what they do. But that's not necessarily your identity, right? That is what you are living reflected back to you, but that's not who you are. And so she goes on to say that she gets a lot of descriptions like friendly, shy, assertive, intelligent, honest, and so on. But then she noticed something else over the years, and she talks about how students of color usually mentioned their racial or ethnic group. Like, I'm Black, Puerto Rican, Korean American. White students rarely mention being white. She also talks about how women usually mention being female, but men don't usually mention their maleness. Jewish students often say they are Jewish, but Protestants rarely mention that they're Protestant. And then she said a student who is comfortable revealing it or open may mention being gay, lesbian, or bisexual. Even though she knows that most of the participants are heterosexual, it is very unusual for anyone to include their heterosexuality on their list. So let's just process that for a minute, because I think if you are listening to this and being absolutely honest, this is so true. When have you ever had somebody be like, tell me a little bit about yourself, or describe yourself to me? Who are you? And to say I am white, or to have a man be like, I'm a white man. I do hear that from time to time on social media because I am in those spaces, but it is not the norm. And I've never heard somebody in a group setting describe themselves in that way. However, I have heard many Black people describe themselves and say, I'm a Black woman, and they find their identity in that. But we don't. White people do that very often. And men don't often describe themselves as a man unless they're in some argument about manliness, right? Then she says, and this is a quote, common across these examples is that in the areas where a person is a member of the dominant or advantaged social group, the category is usually not mentioned. That element of the person's identity is so taken for granted that it goes without comment. It is taken for granted by them because it is taken for granted by the dominant culture. I put a huge star by that, along with highlighting it, because I had no notes really. We take those dominant traits and dominant identities for granted, so we don't need to comment because it is the dominant identity. And then she goes on to say that the parts of our identity that do capture our attention are those that other people notice and that reflect back to us. So it's definitely interesting. And then she says about the countless ways one might be defined as exceptional, but there's at least 7 categories of otherness. Because if you have one of these subordinate or non-dominant identities, for instance, being a woman, right? People are commonly defined as other, so they're othered. It's not the norm that is widely accepted by society. And so people are commonly defined as other on the basis of race or ethnicity, gender, including gender expression, religion, sexual orientation, socioeconomic status, age, and physical or mental ability. And then each of those categories has a form of oppression that is associated with them, right? Racism, sexism, religious oppression or anti-Semitism, heterosexism, classism, ageism, ableism, so on and so forth. But in each of those identities, there is a group that is considered dominant. And I'm putting this in the notes, but by dominant, she says systematically advantaged by the society because of group membership. So whether society as a group considers you to be a member of this group, or whether you identify as a member of that group. That is why when we talk about privilege, some people that are white presenting talk about how they potentially experience more or have more privilege than people that are not white presenting. Is because even though they might not identify with that group, society as a whole, when they just see them, will often associate them as being a member of that group. So she talks about the dominant, the systematically advantaged because of the group membership, and then the group considered subordinate or targeted, which is systemically disadvantaged. And she goes on to say, when we think about our multiple identities, most of us will find that we are both dominant and targeted at the same time. But it is the targeted identities that hold our attention and the dominant identities that often go unexamined. Yeah. So it's the targeted ones. That's the other. Those are the ones that hold our attention or seem different. But the dominant identity, it goes unexamined, unacknowledged. Then she talks about Audre Lorde's essay, Age, Race, Class, and Sex, Women Redefining Difference. And I love this, so I'm going to read it. It is with this mythical norm that the trappings of power reside within society. Those of us who stand outside that power often identify one way in which we are different, and we assume that to be the primary cause of all oppression, forgetting other distortions around difference, some of which we ourselves may be practicing. And I really like that, and I want to read that essay at some point by Audre Lorde. And then this quote, if I am impatient with a white woman for not recognizing her white privilege, it may be useful for me to remember how much of my life I spent oblivious to the fact of the daily advantages I receive simply because I am heterosexual, or the ways in which I may take my class privilege for granted. And that really stuck out to me because I know that especially when we're on the anti-racism journey, it is so common and happens seemingly so quickly for us to start getting impatient with other white people or white women And I'm so guilty of this myself, so please don't think I'm preaching at you. But it is so common that we get very impatient with them. Like, how can they not understand? Not realizing. And Portia Noir, she talks about how, like, you just got here. Like, you're being judgmental about those people, but you yourself just got here. And I think that this is kind of saying a similar thing. Like, we're impatient, but then taking it another step too, that like still not acknowledging the privileges that we do have. So for me, like, I would look at it sort of like when I'm judging a man for mansplaining to me and not realizing how often I've used my privilege and white-splained to other people. Because we're both white, right? Like, if it's a white man, yeah. So I think that that's an important thing to like sit with and possibly journal about as well. And then she talks about how the dominant group has the greatest influence in determining the structure of the society. So that's reflected in determining who gets the best jobs, whose history will be taught in school, or whose relationships will be validated by society. And that is, we see it all around us every day. It's just so true. Like, the dominant groups are kind of dictating the structure of our greater society that we live in. And she talks about how the inequitable social relations, the dominant group is seen as the norm for humanity. And Jean Baker Miller talks about this, who is author of Toward a New Psychology of Women, which I'll be noting in the description. But the inequitable social relations are seen as the model for normal human relationships. Consequently, it remains perfectly acceptable in many circles to tell jokes, for instance, that denigrate a certain group, or to oppose initiatives that might challenge the power balance. I highlighted that one, or might change the power balance. So if we're, anyways. And then she says, Miller points out that dominant groups generally do not like to be reminded of the existence of inequality. So true. Like, I have nothing to say because that's so true. I see it in my comments all the time. Like, people don't want to be reminded of or told that there is inequality. We're all equal. We all should be equal. I love everyone. Yeah, okay. But you're in the dominant group. Am I going to just like trust you on that? Probably not. I'm going to more pay attention to your actions. And somebody saying those things to me is kind of a red flag. Not that I won't talk to them, because I just got here too, but maybe we're not necessarily at the same place, like in our learning journey. And then she says, the truth is that the dominants do not really know what the experience of the subordinates is. In contrast, the subordinates are very well informed about the dominants. And that's because in a society where you are constantly manipulated and oppressed, you need to pay attention to what the oppressor is doing so that you can prevent the harm. Just like she talks about this in the book too. And I thought of the example, like, even before I read it, but it's just like women that are in abusive relationships, especially emotionally abusive relationships. Like, I have experience with that. And you learn to become very, very attuned to the emotional state of the abuser. And that is because you're trying to protect yourself and you need to know where they're at so that you can try to prevent the harm and prevent the rage. And oppressed people do that in every kind of scenario. So that's why very often, in my opinion, we see, Black people refer to white people as a whole, as a group, because they have literally been having to study us and realize the ways in which we are dangerous since they were born, essentially. Since they were old enough to understand, they had to learn that, and their parents had to teach them that. We don't know anything about that. We don't know anything about the group that is oppressed, that we are the oppressors of, because we never had to learn. We didn't need to guess what they were going to do. Anyway, what else? This one was huge. So she says, and this is all quote, in his now classic essay, I Won't Learn From You, Herbert Cole identifies one form of resistance, not learning, demonstrated by targeted students who are too often seen by their dominant teachers as others. Not learning tends to take place when someone has to deal with unavoidable challenges to her or his personal and family loyalties, integrity, and identity. In such situations, there are forced choices and no apparent middle ground. To agree to learn from a stranger who does not respect your integrity causes a major loss of self. The only alternative is to not learn and reject the stranger's world. So I think a lot of times that is like the form of resistance we see, where it is the opposite. So you are not trying to learn or be associated with that person. And I'm still thinking through this a little bit. I did the pink highlights so that I could ponder it some more and potentially journal about it. So I'm sure it will be in the description. But I think that that is where that resistance comes in, where we see people and we try to claim reverse racism. Oh, you're racist. No, they're just not learning from the dominant person that has never respected them, or the dominant group that has never respected them, right? Like when people say white people are dangerous. First of all, I'm white and I agree with that because I have seen the danger of white people and white women. But then there's the opposite that she also talks about, that is when people almost like assimilate to the dominant group. And she talks about that in here. And she says, Jewish people who want to change the Semitic look of their noses, Asian people who have cosmetic surgery to alter the shape of their eyes, Black people who seek to lighten their skin with bleaching creams. So there's like the one extreme to not learn, to the other to appropriate in some way. And especially when Kamala was running for president, a lot of people heard for the first time about code switching, when you speak a certain way and you change that way of speaking when you're talking to groups. I do that. You would never know. I actually have a Southern accent, but when I speak in videos or sometimes audio messages, it doesn't come out. When I'm just talking to people on the phone, it often comes out and I talk like this. But I don't speak like that because I learned a long time ago that people of the dominant groups considered me to be less intelligent when I spoke with my real voice. And so code switching is one of those things too, in which we assimilate. And then the people that go fully in the opposite direction to not learn from the people, they're considered rebels, violent, divisive, resistant. They literally are resisting, yes, and that's okay. Yeah. And she talks about how many of us are both dominant and subordinate in different ways. So for instance, I'm a woman. I am not heterosexual. I don't identify as heterosexual. So those two things would other me, right? But I'm white, and in that way I am in a dominant, so I'm both a dominant and a subordinate. I also have disabilities. I have autism and ADHD, which is another subordinate, but I'm able-bodied, so in a way that kind of makes me part of a dominant, at least in my mind. Because when people see me, they see an able-bodied person. And then she talks about how Audre Lorde, from the vantage point as a Black lesbian, says there's no hierarchy of oppression. And then Dr. Tatum writes, there is a need to acknowledge each other's pain, even as we attend to our own. And I just love that line. There's a need to acknowledge each other's pain, even as we attend to our own. She goes on to discuss, and this is a quote, when the perspective of the subordinate is shared directly, an image is reflected to members of the dominant group that is disconcerting. To the extent that one can draw on one's own experience of subordination as a young person, as a person with a disability, as someone who grew up poor, as a woman, it may be easier to make meaning of another targeted group's experience. For those readers who are targeted by racism and are angered by the obliviousness of whites, sometimes described in these pages, it may be useful to attend to your experience of dominance where you may find it. As a heterosexual, as an able-bodied person, as a Christian, as a man, and consider what systems of privilege you may be overlooking. The task of resisting our own oppression does not relieve us of the responsibility of acknowledging our complicity in the oppression of others. I'm going to read that one more time. The task of resisting our own oppression does not relieve us of the responsibility of acknowledging our complicity in the oppression of others. Yep. And that especially, at least in my circles, reminds me of lots of women who say, I'm a woman, I'm oppressed too. Right. And there's no hierarchy to oppression, but you have to realize that it is still highly important to advocate for and prioritize the oppression of others, not just your own. Yeah. So it was a good chapter, guys. I thought so. I got so much out of it. Like there was times when I was reading on my couch and I'm by myself reading this. And I was just like, wow, that's powerful. So on Friday, we will be starting into part 2 of the book, which is called Understanding Blackness in a White Context, which should be interesting. And chapter 3 specifically is called The Early Years. And there's a quote, is my skin brown because I drink chocolate milk? I know that the first sentence of chapter 3 starts out about thinking of your earliest race-related memory. And I have a video that I did a while back. I'm not sure if I've posted it on YouTube yet. It was originally on TikTok, but I did a video about the first time that I really, at least that I remember, that I realized that I was white. And it was when I was in nursing school. And I do believe that I did post that in the last couple of days. I would have to go back and see. But it talks about that, about identity and first realizing that you're white, but then also realizing your privilege that you have, at least for me, the privilege I had. So I might talk about that more on Friday after I have finished reading chapter 3. But I'm excited. I hope y'all are enjoying this. Please drop a comment and let me know if you are, or if there's anything specific that you think would be helpful. If you want to, like, I don't know, I can't really think of any ideas because I'm doing what the ideas that I had already. So if you think of any ideas or things that you would like me to discuss, or in a direction that you'd like to see me go in these videos while I'm working through this book, please let me know. Very open to that. I'm really enjoying talking about it with my friends and with you all, even though I can't see your comments in real time. Like, we're not talking back and forth. But sometimes that's easier for me as well. With autism, it's sometimes hard for me to think on the spot. And so I don't do as well, like in group situations, like the book club I'm in. It's easier for me to have some time to ponder what I read for myself and then share my thoughts about it. And the book club I'm in does give the questions in advance so we can do so. But sometimes even hearing a bunch of other people's, what they think and their experiences, it like messes my brain up, because then I'm thinking about other things. And it's probably the ADHD combined with the autism, if I'm real. I'm like, oh, well, I did have a train of thought, but now it is gone. Bye. Anyways, but yeah, I appreciate y'all. I'm about to go try to use my rice cooker for the first time. My friend got it for me, and I'm like really excited about it because I love rice and I hate cooking. So yeah, we'll see how that goes. But y'all are great. Drop a comment, and thanks for being here and coming along for the journey. And I'm sorry I couldn't read the whole chapter to you, but hopefully the summary was somewhat helpful, as well as the description with some key quotes and prompts and stuff. Yeah. Let me know if I can help in any other ways. Okay, bye.